Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor, moderated by Professor Mike Kaler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA.
Kreller has been the leader in enhanced due diligence involving FCPA compliance programs since 1988. Our boots-on-the-ground research combined with our in-house team of licensed investigators allows us to continually outperform even the most sophisticated database providers. For the past 30 years, Kreller has become synonymous with high-quality, decisionable reports that uncover hidden truths that our competitors routinely miss. Kreller also has a best-in-class case management system, Kreller Online, which allows for companies to develop and administer their own questionnaires, risk ranking scoring, and third-party training, while continuously monitoring the companies and shareholders through worldwide sanction lists.
Thank you for listening to the FCPA Flash podcast. This is Professor Mike Kaler, and I invite you to my next FCPA Institute in Nashville on May 3rd through the 4th. To learn more about the two-day FCPA Institute and how it has elevated the FCPA knowledge and practical skills of a diverse group of professionals, please visit fcpaprofessor.com and click on the FCPA Institute page. Welcome to FCPA Flash, sponsored by Kreller. This is Professor Mike Kaler, and in this episode I'm pleased to be joined by Jason Prince, a partner at Holland Hart who maintains his offices in Boise, Idaho and Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Professor Kaler.
Mr. Prince represents and counsels exporters and multinational companies on an array of international trade compliance issues. This includes not just FCPA compliance, but also compliance with the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, Export Administration Regulations, and other regulations impacting international business. So Holland Hart, the firm that you're a partner at, is well known for having a footprint in several western states, but then again, the FCPA does not just apply to large, well-known business organizations, perhaps on the east or west coast. So what common questions or issues do you and your firm often receive from your client base regarding FCPA issues?
Well, to provide some additional context about Holland Hart's clients and my international practice and that of the others in my international trade compliance group, Holland Hart has 15 offices in 8 western states and the District of Columbia, about 470 attorneys, and we're mainly, as you mentioned, in the Mountain West and growing markets like Denver and Salt Lake City and Las Vegas and Boise. We were founded about 70 years ago, just over 70 years ago in Denver, and at that time the focus was on energy and natural resources, which helps to explain the principally Mountain West footprint. But over time, the firm has grown and expanded its industry sectors such that we now represent companies in an array of industries, from multinational Fortune 500 companies to medium-sized exporters that are based in the Mountain West. And my personal practice reflects that industry scope and range of clients. And so I was born and raised in Boise. My wife and I chose to settle down here and raise a family here, but the firm allows me to work principally in Washington, D.C. with my colleagues there. And so I do help clients that are multinational Fortune 500 companies, but those small and medium-sized exporters that are based in the West. And what I find is clients at both ends of that spectrum face a lot of the same issues. And principally, the one that I see recurring over and over and over again, one that they're constantly grappling with, are the issue of third-party agents, those foreign intermediaries, whether it be a sales representative or a distributor or a broker or a consultant. They're trying to figure out how to minimize their FCPA risk or exposure that comes with using those third-party agents to do business abroad. And the difference between the multinational corporations and the medium-sized exporters is principally one of scope and scale. We have clients that have hundreds of third-party intermediaries in dozens of countries around the world, and we have clients that have a single export market where they're using a single distributor or sales agent, and they all have to deal with issues of due diligence before you engage the third party, what contract terms to put in your agreements with those third parties, what written certifications to require from them, and how often to require those written certifications, how to monitor the activities of those third parties, and then how to audit their books and records and include contractual provisions to give you the right to do so. And again, it's an issue of scope and scale and resources. Some of our large clients have the ability to provide training to those third-party agents in their foreign language and provide written materials in the foreign language. Other of our clients simply don't have that sort of money to devote towards their compliance programs, and so they have to find other ways to make sure that they're appropriately minimizing their risk.
Now,
another topic.
Yeah, go ahead.
Another topic that we see a lot of questions about is facilitating payments. Before I jump into that, did you have a specific thought or question about the third-party agent issue?
Well, yeah, I recently published a post on my FCPA Professor website in which, in various policy documents, including the FCPA guidance and other places, the DOJ and the SEC have said some very sensible things about small to medium-sized enterprises and how they have less expectations, I guess you could say, for compliance, given the size and resources, than they would for big multinational companies. Do you necessarily see that, though, reflected in the enforcement actions that are out there? There are, a fair number of enforcement actions, including companies in the Mountain West region, concerning third-party practices. And at least from my perspective, it seems like the same expectations, notwithstanding what government guidance may suggest.
Well, I saw your post, and I would recommend it to any of your listeners who are interested in this topic, because I think you did a good job of identifying specific examples of smaller companies that have had enforcement actions brought against them. And in terms of the impact that has on the way in which I counsel clients, I still think that regardless of that trend that you've noted, that there still has to be a rule of reason, if not based on the enforcement activity, just based on the business reality, that certain companies simply don't have the resources to throw at the FCPA and its compliance with it as the large multinational companies, and so they have to be looking for creative ways to minimize risk and to create a compliance program that's narrowly tailored to fit their specific risk profile. And that's what the focus has to be on, is finding that sweet spot between having enough resources devoted to your compliance program that you can justify it and stand behind it if there's that unfortunate incident that leads to the DOJ or the SEC bringing an enforcement action, but by the same token not devoting so many resources to it that it's disproportionate to your company's risk and therefore just not good business. And that's the focus when I'm talking to clients, and not so much on what's the chance you're going to have an enforcement action brought against you because you're smaller than the average target company that the DOJ or SEC pursues. It's just let's find that spot that's right for your company that we can defend if there is an enforcement action.
And you also mentioned facilitation payments as a common question you get from clients?
Right, and I think I'm seeing a little bit more in terms of questions on that issue, principally because, as you know, the U.S. is increasingly becoming a more and more extreme minority in terms of countries that have Corrupt Practices Act type legislation that addresses or deals with foreign officials and payments to those types of individuals, where the UK Bribery Act and Canada's Corruption of Public Foreign Officials Act, South Korea, they've all in relatively recent years done away with or considered and rejected the facilitating payments exception. And just recently, Australia indicated their Senate had a report that came out indicating that they may move away from the facilitating payments exception. And some of our clients have operations in those countries. And so the question has arisen increasingly of, to the extent in our current policies we allow facilitating payments and we put certain safeguards in place to limit them, should we just be outright prohibiting them? And there are plenty of companies out there that do just ban facilitating payments across the board with no exceptions. And then there are still some companies that try and recognize that the U.S. Congress, at the time it enacted the FCPA in 1977, didn't create a facilitating payments exception at that time, but at least recognized that there was this issue. And then, of course, in the 1988 amendments, amended the FCPA to make it more express or explicit that these types of small facilitating or expediting payments, which, as you know, are referred to in the legislative history in places as grease payments, that although they're essentially bribes, that they're, as a matter of U.S. policy, acceptable. There are some companies that say, well, the Congress decided that, so let's make sure that we allow for that exception when it's appropriate. The other question I get is, if we decide to ban facilitating payments, should we even mention it in our written policies? Because if you mention facilitating payments, because there's such a fine line between a facilitating payment and a bribe, it sometimes just adds more confusion for employees than if you just, in your policy, say we don't allow bribes, period, and don't try and tease out that distinction. So that's something that we're dealing with and trying to help clients in terms of drafting their written policies.
No, I completely agree with that regarding facilitation payments, and I'll make the analogy to parenting, because when you think about it, there's a lot of compliance lessons that can be learned from parenting. So imagine a parent tells their young children, lectures them for 50 minutes on the importance of cleaning their room, but the last 5 minutes they give them a rationale and a justification for not cleaning their room. Well, what's the child going to remember? Probably the last 5 minutes of the training. And I think when you train rank and file employees on the facilitation payments exception, you're really just giving them terms of art to rationalize and justify their conduct, and arguably increasing, not decreasing, your FCPA risk.
That's right, and that's something that each company has to assess that issue and decide how they want to tackle it, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach.
Now, the FCPA, of course, is just one U.S. law that impacts companies doing business in the global marketplace. And in the introduction, I mentioned the fact that you provide compliance services not just to the FCPA, but the many other U.S. law and regulations which impact exporters and others. Do you think there's too much focus on the FCPA and FCPA compliance vis-a-vis some of these other laws?
I don't know if there's necessarily too much focus, and to the extent there obviously is more focus on the FCPA than the ITAR, the EAR, the OFAC trade sanctions programs. I think that's by virtue of just the nature of those other laws and their scope. So with the ITAR, you're dealing with international defense trade companies that sell defense articles and defense services to foreign militaries, and that's regulated by the Department of State. And then you've got the EAR, which is limited to companies principally, not entirely, but principally they're focused on dual use technology and hardware. And then you've got the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, that has their trade sanctions regulations, which deal in part with embargoed countries, where historically were countries where a lot of companies were not going to be interested in doing business anyway. For example, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Syria. But most recently, we've seen Russia emerge as a sanctions target country, and that's a country where a lot of U.S. businesses are already doing significant business. And then also you have Venezuela as a sanctions target. You also have, of course, the sanctions list of OFAC, this specially designated nationals and block list that pertains to individuals and entities with which you cannot do business. And so it's broader in scope, and I think all companies need to be aware of it, and it's increasingly becoming so, especially as OFAC is enforcing more against non-financial institutions, companies that are just exporting, for example. But all that said, you turn to the FCPA, and it applies to every company, public or private, across all industries, across all foreign markets. And so I think that in large part explains why there is a much greater focus on the FCPA than those other areas of international trade compliance law. And in terms of that focus, some of it is driven by media interest and the headlines that you see splashed across newspapers where in recent years we've seen companies with household name recognition being hit with massive penalties, and they often involve juicy details of human interest that people are more likely to read the article than perhaps some of the slightly more arcane regulatory issues. So all of that combines, I think, to make the FCPA much more at the top of companies' minds and certainly folks in the C-suite.
So what's your best advice for business organizations as to how to view compliance, so-called holistically, and perhaps not through the separate silos of, this is our FCPA compliance program, this is our ITAR compliance program, this is our you name it compliance program, but more to, integrate this, synthesize this, if you will?
So just as a starting point on that question, because it is something that we're constantly encouraging our clients to do, is to integrate those different areas, because they can be readily integrated from a policy perspective and from a procedures perspective, is to look specifically at Part 130 of the ITAR. It's the regulations that implement Section 39 of the Arms Export Control Act, and you touch upon it in your article, The Story of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which, again, if your listeners have not read that before, I highly recommend it, because it is a comprehensive review of the legislative history that led to the FCPA, but also to Part 130 of the ITAR, and it, of course, springs out of the Watergate hearings and certain testimony during those hearings related to improper payments being made to foreign officials. And Congress then launched congressional hearings focusing on that issue, and out of that sprang the FCPA in 1977, but shortly before that, Part 130 of the ITAR. And you talk in your article, which was in the Ohio State Law Journal, about how there were two schools of thought. That one school of thought was saying, let's just prohibit these improper payments outright. And there was another school of thought that said, no, let's take the sunshine as the best disinfectant approach and focus on transparency and require reporting of payments that are made to foreign officials. And the FCPA, of course, came down principally on the side of prohibition under the anti-bribery provisions, but there's also the books and records provisions and the accounting provisions that relate more towards transparency, whereas Part 130 came down squarely in the camp of transparency, and they actually have dollar thresholds that trip your requirement to send reports to the Department of State's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, where you report to them the fees or commissions or political contributions that you've made in relation to sales. And again, there are various dollar thresholds that you have to trip, unlike the FCPA, which has no de minimis exception. But the way that those two areas of the law interact, besides just the historical link between the two, is that often, if you look at the few instances where there have been enforcement actions involving Part 130, it doesn't take much digging to realize that there's also evidence of FCPA violations there. And so the two will often go hand in hand. And if you have an FCPA enforcement action brought against you and you're in the international defense trade industry, chances are you're going to see Part 130 violations that the government is going to seize upon. And then the other aspect of it is that because if you're in the international defense trade industry, you have to report, and you're therefore creating not just records, but records that are given to the government as to the fees and commissions and political contributions you're making. there, to a certain extent, is a higher risk that if your books and records, internal books and records, don't match up with or accurately reflect what's in those reports you've made to the U.S. State Department, that you could get yourself in extremely hot water because of that disconnect. So we talk to clients about, in that area, in the Part 130 FCPA area, looking at that as just one big anti-corruption issue, and you incorporate all the different elements of the FCPA and Part 130 into your due diligence, into your contractual provisions, into your monitoring of your third parties. And that's just one example of how to make sure that you're not just putting on your blinders and looking solely at FCPA, because those two closely integrate. And the same is true of, for example, the trade sanctions programs. A lot of the due diligence you need to do in determining whether to engage a certain third party or whether to make a sale in a certain market is going to go hand in hand with the due diligence you would do for anti-corruption purposes, and your policies and your procedures can and should reflect that overlap between those various areas of the law.
The final question I'd like to ask you is kind of a big picture question. And in the mid-1970s, one of the key leaders on Capitol Hill when it came to what would become the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was Idaho Senator Frank Church. And last fall, you helped arrange an FCPA at 40 symposium at Boise State University, and listeners should definitely review that video. It's on YouTube and widely available on the internet. It's a very interesting discussion concerning a lot of these issues. The question I have is, kind of asking you to put yourself in Senator Church's shoes for a moment, and that is, what do you think his reaction would be to the modern era of FCPA enforcement, including that with each decade there seems to be more, not less, FCPA enforcement? Now, politicians obviously have been known to make aspirational statements, and when the FCPA was passed, there were many statements along the lines of, well, this statute will eliminate bribery and corruption. So what do you think Senator Frank Church would say if we're seeing more enforcement, not less enforcement over time?
Well, and unfortunately, Senator Church passed away in 1984 at the far too young age of 59, and so he really didn't have an opportunity to see much, if any, true development of the FCPA. And so if I'm putting myself in his shoes, he was a very intelligent man who had a very good grasp of foreign policy and trends globally, but I don't think he could have, in his wildest dreams, imagined the explosion of international business that's come with globalization and modern technology advances in terms of air travel and the internet and all of those capabilities. And I had the opportunity a number of years ago to take out to lunch Senator Church's former essentially chief legal counsel. It was his longtime advisor and confidant and friend, a gentleman named Carl Burke, who was here locally in Boise. And I just took him out to lunch to ask him about what went on in the kind of behind the scenes leading up to the FCPA. And one story he told me that really stuck out was that Senator Church recognized that they needed buy-in from industry for the FCPA to not just pass, but to actually have any impact. And so they had a meeting where they called together the CEOs of the big players who were engaged in international business, either as multinational corporations or large exporters. And all of these CEOs fit inside one room, and in that one room they basically had a critical mass of the key U.S. International business companies. And I think Senator Church would be astounded today to think of the small, medium-sized businesses that are engaged in international business, either as exporters or even that have set up some sort of facilities abroad. And that, I think, is perhaps the biggest contributor to the rise of FCPA enforcement, and the ongoing relevance of it is there's been exponential growth in the amount of international business, and therefore the amount of opportunities for bribes to potentially be paid. And then, of course, I think Senator Church would have been a supporter of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the transparency emphasis. That was something that was important to Senator Church, was transparency in government, and Section 404 of SOX and its requirement that publicly traded companies assess and then report on their internal controls. That's something that has, I think, obviously contributed to the FCPA enforcement activity. And again, I think that's something he would have approved of and would have supported. Ultimately, I think in terms of the question is, do you think Senator Church would have viewed the FCPA today as being a success? I think he would say yes, because his focus was principally on U.S. moral leadership in the foreign policy arena, not just in terms of corruption, but he obviously was well known for his efforts in shedding light on some of the CIA's activities in trying to topple foreign governments. And so he looked at a lot of foreign policy issues from a moral perspective, and he saw anti-corruption or bribery-related issues as being part of that moral leadership question. And I think he would take solace in the fact that there has been an explosion in at least global awareness of the corruption bribery issue, and we're seeing, it took a while after the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention went into effect in the late 90s. It's taken many years to see an uptick in enforcement action, but it's gradually happening, and we're seeing more and more cooperation between the U.S. law enforcement and their foreign counterparts in sharing information and pursuing bribery so that there's more of a level playing field. And all of that, from, I think, Senator Church's perspective, would have helped drive it, kind of an underlying issue, which is bribery hurts people, the actual people in developing countries, because a story he really focused on that came out of the testimony that led to the FCPA was that an official from a company said, well, we pay bribes because we want this country to buy our airplanes. And the question was, well, do they need the airplane? He said, well, no, not really. And ultimately what they were saying is that they wanted them to buy the airplane, and they could buy the airplane. It just meant that the country wouldn't have resources for education and sanitation and basic human needs. So it was the people in those countries who were suffering. So FCPA enforcement and its ongoing relevance to him, I think, would be a sign of success that ultimate goal is still being pursued.
Well, thanks for sharing your perspective on that big picture issue and earlier on the more specific issues. Today's guest has been Jason Prince. He's a partner at Holland Hart, who advises and counsels companies not just on FCPA compliance, but many other laws and regulations which impact companies doing business in the global marketplace. Thank you for being a guest on the FCPA Flash podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been a